The valley of Harrow Vale had buried its trees in the year of the Black Blight, and when the last elm came down for firewood, the fences went with it. 40 families were left to close 40 fields with whatever the ground would give them, and the ground gave them stone, brambles, and the picked clean bones of a hard winter's dead stock. Joren Vask chose the bones. He was 31, broad through the shoulders from 10 years of Knacker's work, and he smelled permanently of ashley no matter how long he scrubbed. His grandfather Emmerich had worked the same trade before him, rendering fallen cattle and sheep into tallow, glue, and bone meal for 3 decades, and had left behind a single object of value, a notebook bound in scorched hide, its pages dense with a Knacker's private arithmetic. Joren had read it by firelight so many times the spine had cracked into 3 pieces held together with waxed twine. The notebook said, "Cure in lime ash lie 3 days, no less, no more. Boil 6 hours until the fat sweats clean. Dry 9 days under cover, turning twice daily. Drill each rod at the 3rd finger's width from the top. String with sinew, not rope. Rope rots, sinew tightens. Space the rods so that a wind of 12 miles or better sets them singing." Nobody in Harrow Vale had ever built a fence meant to sing. Osric Dunn, the valley's reeve, walked the first 11 rods of it on a gray morning in late autumn and did not bother to hide his contempt. He was a heavy, deliberate man who had buried 2 wives and outlasted 3 bad harvests, and he trusted nothing that could not be weighed, sold, or eaten. Bones, he said, belong in a stew pot or a grinding mill, not standing upright pretending to be a wall. "It isn't pretending to be a wall," Joren said. "It's pretending to be a warning." Osric spat near the base of a rod, close enough that Joren noted it, and said nothing. "A warning against what?" "Wolves haven't come down from the high country in 6 years. 6 years is a long quiet," Joren said. "Long quiet's end." He kept a ledger of his own, separate from his grandfather's notebook, and in it he recorded every rod he raised. Bone count per rod. 11. Always 11. No more, no fewer. Cure days, dry days, the date driven into the ground, and the wind speed at which each length of fence began to hum. By the time the first hard frost came, the ledger listed 61 rods across 440 yards, with a gap of 160 yards left unbuilt for want of bone. His dog, an unremarkable brindle bitch named Bramble, would not walk within 10 feet of the finished fence when the wind rose. She'd flatten her ears and circle wide, and Joren took this at first for simple animal foolishness, the same foolishness that made her bark at thunder and hide from the shears. He did not yet understand that Bramble was not afraid of the fence. She was listening to it the way he wished the whole valley would learn to listen. 6 miles east, on the higher pasture where the grass thinned to scrub and rock, Marta was having an argument of her own. She was 28, sharp-boned, quieter than Joren by nature and twice as stubborn, and she kept sheep the valley considered an embarrassment. Not the fat, docile ewes that filled the lower pastures and dressed out well at market, but a scattered flock of Crookhorn rams, animals with twisted, asymmetrical horns, narrow chests, poor wool, and worse meat yield. 2 generations of Harrow Vale shepherds had culled the Crookhorn line out of existence everywhere except Marta's 12 acres, because her Aunt Iona Kell, a drover dead these 4 winters, had refused to let her. Iona's own notebook, a drover's ledger, water-stained, its corners chewed soft by mice, did not talk about wool or meat at all. It talked about stance. Test them against noise, it read. A sack dropped hard behind the flock. Watch which animals turn to face it and which run. Cull the runners. Breed the ones who turn. Feed the turners heavy through autumn. Tallow crusts twice weekly. Extra grain before first frost. Because an animal that will hold its ground needs the weight to hold it with. Marta had followed the ledger exactly, and the valley had laughed at her exactly as long as she'd done it. "Crookhorns," said old Dessa, her nearest neighbor and the only person in the valley who didn't laugh, "won't fetch 2 coppers a head at the autumn market." "They're not for market," Marta said. "Then what are they for?" Marta didn't have a full answer yet. She had a feeling, inherited the way Iona's stubbornness had been inherited, that an animal willing to stand was worth more than an animal that dressed out well, and that the valley's habit of breeding for size and yield had quietly bred the courage out of every flock in it. Her first attempt at proving this had gone badly. She'd chosen her 4 largest rams for the stance test, assuming size meant steadiness, and dropped a grain sack behind them from 6 feet. 3 bolted outright. The 4th turned, but broke formation the instant a second sack fell, scattering the ewes he was meant to be anchoring. Marta had stood in the frost-hard field afterward, furious with herself, and gone back to Iana's ledger line by line until she found the sentence she'd skipped over the first time. Size is not the trait. Stillness is the trait. A small ram who does not run is worth 6 large ones who do. She retested with her smallest, ugliest animals, the ones the market wouldn't have taken as a gift, and found 2 rams who turned toward the noise both times, ears forward, feet planted. She named them for nothing in particular, Grief and Anvil, and built her breeding line around them alone. By the second autumn, she had 22 Crookhorns bred for stance instead of size, fed heavy on tallow crust through the last 6 weeks before frost, holding formation against noise, thrown stones, even a dropped cartwheel. Her horse, an aging bay gelding named Cinder, had grown so used to standing near the flock during these drills that he no longer startled at the ram's stamping, though he still shied violently at anything approaching from the tree line to the north, a habit Marta noted and did not yet understand the use of. Osric Dunn visited her pasture the same week he'd mocked Joren's fence. 22 animals, he said. Eating winter feed meant for stock that'll actually feed this valley. And not one of them worth slaughtering. They're not for slaughtering, Marta said. Then, like your neighbor's bone fence, they're for nothing. They're for holding, Marta said. Same as his. Osric didn't understand what she meant, and neither, fully, did she. Not yet. The first rail warning came from Joren's apprentice, a bony, watchful boy of 13 named Pell, who found wolf tracks pressed into frost near the fence's unfinished gap in the second week of the deep cold. He ran the 1.5 to Joren's yard without stopping, and arrived too winded to speak, simply pointing north and holding up both hands, fingers spread, twice. 20? Joren said. Pell shook his head, caught his breath, and said, 14. Big ones. Thin. Hungry thin. Joren went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the frost. 14 wolves meant a pack driven down by starvation in the high country, the same high country Marta's pasture backed onto, and a hungry pack that size did not scatter. It hunted in a line, and it hunted the weakest gap. His fence had won. The unbuilt 160 yards sat exactly where the valley narrowed into a natural throat between 2 low ridges, the same throat, though Joren did not yet know it, that Marta's northern pasture fence abutted from the other side. He went to his ledger that night and did arithmetic he didn't want to do. 61 rods finished. 160 yards open. Each rod took 4 bones worth of cure time compounded across 9 drying days, meaning even working through the night, he could not close the gap before the ground froze hard enough to make new digging impossible. He had, by his own count, 8 days. He rode to Marta's pasture the next morning, the first time either of them had sought the other out. 14 wolves coming down through the throat, he said, without preamble, because there was no time for preamble. My fence has a gap right where your northern boundary sits. Marta studied him with the flat, assessing look she gave a ram she hadn't decided about yet. And you want my rams to plug a hole in your fence. I want your rams to hold a line while my fence does what it's built to do. It won't stop them. It'll slow them and warn us they're coming. That's all bone ever does. That's not nothing, Marta said, surprising herself. No, Joren agreed. It's not nothing. It's also not enough alone. Neither trusted the other's method completely. Joren thought crookhorns were an old woman's superstition dressed up as breeding science, and Marta thought a fence that sang in the wind was closer to a charm than a wall. But they were both being laughed at by the same man, for the same reason, and that counted for something even if neither said so aloud. They did not have 8 days after all. They had 5. The temperature dropped hard on the 3rd night, the kind of cold that split green wood and silenced birds by mid-afternoon, and with it came a wind out of the north steady enough to set every finished yard of Joren's fence humming continuously, not the occasional gust-driven note he'd recorded in his ledger, but a low, sustained tone that carried, by Pell's estimate, better than half a mile. It was the wind, more than the wolves, that told them the timeline had collapsed. Joren worked through both remaining nights without sleep, driving what rods he had left into ground that fought him with every strike of them all, while Marta drove her flock down from the high pasture toward the throat, positioning Grief and Anvil at the formation's outer points exactly as Iona's ledger prescribed. Smallest, steadiest animals holding the corners, ewes and lambs pressed to the center. Osric Dunn arrived at the throat on the fourth morning to order both of them to abandon the effort and drive every animal, human included, down to the walled grange at the valley's center. He found Joren still short 40 bones of finishing the gap, and Marta's flock strung across open ground with no fence at all behind them. "This is madness," Osric said. "Neither of you has anything that will hold against 14 wolves." "Alone? No," Joren said, not looking up from his work. "That's why there's 2 of us." Osric had no answer for that, and for the first time did not immediately mock him for it. He stayed. He told himself it was to watch them fail. It was not entirely that. The wolves came at dusk on the 5th day, exactly as thin and exactly as desperate as Pell had described them, moving in the low, economical trot of animals that had not eaten properly in 3 weeks. They hit the finished length of bone fence first and stopped. Not from the barrier itself. A hungry wolf will test a fence half this height without pausing, but from the sound. The wind had not slackened, and 61 rods driven along 440 yards produced a continuous, layered hum that no animal born in that country had ever heard a fence make before. 2 wolves at the pack's edge broke stride and peeled wide, unwilling to pass close along the singing line, exactly as Bramble had refused to for weeks. The pack narrowed instead of spreading, funneled by the fence's unbroken length toward the one gap left open, the throat, where Marta's flock stood waiting. Grief took the first charge. He did not run. Iona's ledger, for winters in the ground, had bred that single fact into him more surely than any command could have, and he lowered his twisted horns and held his footing while a wolf twice his weight struck him and was thrown sideways by the impact, more surprised than injured. Anvil held the opposite point. The ewes stayed pressed to the center exactly as drilled, and for 11 full seconds, Marta would count them later, over and over, unable to stop. The Crookhorn line held a gap that any ordinary flock would have scattered from in the first heartbeat. It was not enough on its own. Marta had known it wouldn't be. A wolf broke past Anvil's shoulder, and a second slipped along the fence's very edge, testing the unfinished gap Joren had not managed to close. That was where Osric Dunn stopped being a spectator. He was close enough, and he did the only thing available to a man with no bone rod of his own and no time to fetch one. He seized an unfinished length of dried bone from Joren's cart, a spare rod, not yet strung, not yet driven, and drove it point first into the half-finished gap himself, wedging it crosswise against the last standing post, closing the line by 4 feet with his own bulk braced behind it. It held only a few seconds. It did not need to hold longer. Those seconds were enough for Cinder, Marta's gelding, who had shied for 2 seasons at anything moving along that northern tree line and had never once been believed for it, to bolt directly at the gap instead of away from it, screaming and striking with both forehooves at the wolf, trying to slip past Osric's makeshift barrier, driving it back into the open where the fence's unbroken hum still held the rest of the pack at a wary, circling distance. The wolves broke off within the hour, unwilling to press a kill against sound they didn't understand and a line that kept refusing to open where it should have. 14 had come down. 14 went back up into the high country by morning, and Harrow Vale had lost not one animal, human, or Crookhorn ram in the exchange, though Grief walked with a hitch in his left foreleg for the rest of that winter, and wore it, Marta always said afterward, like a badge he'd earned rather than an injury he'd suffered. Osric Dunn stood at the gap for a long time after, one hand still pressed against the bone rod he'd wedged there, saying nothing. He had spent 2 seasons calling one method a superstition and the other a waste of good feed, and he had just watched neither method work alone and both work together, in the space of 11 counted seconds and 1 gelding's charge. He let go of the rod. He looked at Joren, then at Marta, and said only, "Finish the gap properly. I'll send men to help you cure the bone." It was the closest thing to an apology either of them ever heard from him. Joren's ledger, that night, recorded the gap, closed at last, 16 new rods, 440 yards becomes 600, no bones left unaccounted for. Marta's herd book recorded 22 Crookhorns still living, 1 lame, none lost, and beside grief's name, she wrote a single word she never explained to anyone: held. The two of them stood at the mended line the next morning, in the flat gray light before the sun cleared the ridge, neither one certain what to say to the other after 5 days of doubting each other's judgment as thoroughly as the valley had doubted both of them. Marta broke the silence first. Your fence didn't stop them. No, Joren said. It just told them where not to go. That's what my rams did too. I know. He looked at the mended gap, at the bone rod Osric had wedged there still, standing crosswise against the post. Neither one of us was wrong. We just weren't whole. Marta considered that, and found she had nothing to correct in it. You'll do, she said, for a fence builder. You'll do, Joren answered, for a shepherd. It was the whole of what either of them said, and it was enough. The valley of Harrow Vale kept both the bone fence and the Crookhorn line long after that winter, and told the story of the night the wolves came down for years afterward at every hearth that would listen. Though the version passed hand to hand eventually trimmed away the arguing, the doubt, and the 2 long seasons of mockery that came before, leaving only the wolves, the singing bones, and the small, ugly rams who would not run. What the valley remembered longest, though, was not the fence or the flock at all, but the simple truth underneath both of them, that the things a hard land calls worthless are very often the only things strong enough to survive it.